Hello everyone, my name is Michael, and today we're going to be having a brief discussion about Telltale's The Walking Dead Season 1. Now, a little bit about my personal connection with this game. I played this when it first came out in 2012 on Xbox 360. I remember going to school and having conversations with people over the cliffhangers that the different episodes would leave you with, and just the buzz and the excitement of people being able to have those conversations and sort of speculate where the story was going to go. But I haven't played it since. I recently saw on PlayStation 5 that they had released a definitive edition, a definitive series that had not only season 1 but all the other seasons and everything that had come out along afterwards, and I hadn't played it since I was a kid, so I thought I'd check it out. Now, we're just going to be talking about season 1. I actually haven't played past that, but season 1 is a very good chunk of story, and I think it's its nice own contained story. So that's all we're going to be talking about. The definitive series that I'm playing this on actually was released in 2019. But the original, again, came out in 2012. It was written by Sean Vanneman and directed and designed by Sean Vanneman, as well as Jake Rodkin. Developed by Telltale Games and published by Telltale Games, as well as Skybound Entertainment. It's a licensed game, obviously built on the Walking Dead IP. I believe originated as a comic created by Robert Kirkman. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that that's the origins of it anyway. So, a little bit about, well, actually, before that, a couple other things that Telltale had created. They're very much known for their point-and-click adventure games, which this is one of those, but they've made the Walking Dead Telltale series. They've done Tales from the Borderlands. They've done The Wolf Among Us, which is another series based on a comic book called Fables. They've done some Sam & Max games, which were sort of original point-and-click games, old school, but these are the more modern takes. So they've done quite a few things. They've been around. They actually closed Telltale in 2018, and I believe they were purchased by LCG Entertainment in 2019. Alright, real quick plot summary. So you play the entirety of the game as a character named Lee Everett. At the beginning of the game, you actually are being taken out of Atlanta, Georgia in the back of a cop car, having been arrested for the murder of a man. You get a little more context as the story progresses. It turns out that Lee actually walks in on his wife cheating on him, and in the scuffle, he accidentally kills that man, and has been arrested for it. So, as he's being driven out, the sheriff is talking to you, and while not paying attention, the monsters of this world that are not yet known to our characters are the dead coming back to life, ergo the Walking Dead. So while the sheriff is having this conversation with you, one of these walkers, as the game calls it, steps out in front of his car. He hits it and then swerves off of the highway through the guardrail and into the woods, knocking Lee unconscious immediately. When Lee comes to, he's handcuffed, he's got a gash on his leg, the sheriff has been launched from the car and is laying dead in a field. He's going to bleed out if he stays in the back of this car, so Lee does the only thing he can do and kicks out the windshield, crawls out of the car, gets the keys to the handcuff, and uncuffs himself. Well, in the process of doing this, that sheriff that was very clearly laying down dead comes back to life and begins to crawl after Lee and attack him. Lee defends himself, but during the commotion caused, a large amount of walkers start to swarm Lee. He goes tearing through the woods and eventually hops over a fence into the safety of a backyard, escaping the monsters for now. He then investigates the house that he has jumped into the backyard of, only to discover it an absolute wreck. There's furniture overturned, there's blood everywhere. It is not a pretty picture. Through his investigations, an answering machine actually starts to play certain messages from the couple, presumably, that lives in this house, making phone calls to leave messages for both the babysitter of the house and their daughter, Clementine. By the end of the messages, a very bleak picture has been painted for the fate of this couple out in Savannah, Georgia. It's not completely confirmed, but it's heavily implied that they did not make it out. Well, during Lee's investigation of the house, he discovers a walkie-talkie, talking into it in hopes of making contact with someone. And the voice on the other end of the walkie-talkie is actually that little girl, Clementine, that we had just mentioned a little bit ago. They have a little bit of conversation. She mentions that she's been out in her treehouse, surviving for days by herself, waiting for her parents to come home from Savannah, Georgia. Well, from your interactions with her, suddenly she screams because the woman who used to be her babysitter, who is now turned into a walker, attacks Lee. Lee tries to defend himself, but because of his injury, he's quickly overpowered. And in just the nick of time is saved by Clementine coming down and handing him a hammer, which he uses to defend himself. After that traumatic situation, Clementine and Lee both decide that it would be best for them to travel together, even though they don't really have a clear idea about where they're going or what's going on. They just know that it's better to be together. Well, this forms a bond and a connection that persists throughout the entire game. For the entirety of the rest of the narrative, Lee will be taking care of Clementine and doing his best to not only help her survive, but thrive in whatever way that he can. So, from here, they travel out onto the road and discover two young men, Chet and his friend Sean Green. You help them move some vehicles, you hop into the car, and narrowly escape a horde of undead out to the Green family farm. From here, you meet some other major characters that we'll go into detail about later, but the rest of the story basically persists of trying to survive these monsters, forming a survival group of people just trying to do what they can to survive, but also sharing a sense of morals to some extent. And eventually the idea sort of becomes to make your way out to Savannah to try to find a boat in hopes that a boat would provide real safety away from these monsters. And the rest of the game sort of becomes this pursuit of everyday survival while also slowly making your way to the coast in the hopes of finding a boat and really escaping the horrible nightmare of a world filled with the undead. And that's sort of the short, simple, sweet version of the plot. Now, there's a lot that happens in between the start and the finish of this story, including at the end of the game, Clementine being kidnapped and needing to be rescued by Lee. There's a lot of major things that happen in between this, but that's sort of the short, sweet, simple foundation of the story. All right. Let's talk about some observations that I made while playing through the game and my loose interpretations of some of the things that I noticed while playing. I guess let's start with Clementine. So Clementine is her own character. She has her own wants and desires. But I also think that Clementine isn't supposed to just be a character. I think Clementine is supposed to represent ideas of innocence and possibly even morality. Throughout the game, Clementine's reaction to most things is to make a moral choice. She always seems to know sort of what the right choice is. Maybe not right in the sense that this would make things easier or this would make survival easier, but just on a morality level. Clementine always seems to represent doing the right thing, despite it being maybe not the smartest thing or the easiest thing. And I think that this sort of represents the idea that innocence and humanity and morality needs to be protected in times of crisis. Clementine herself, throughout the entirety of the game, your objective as a player, outside of just basic survival, really becomes protect Clementine. Protect her from the walkers, protect her from people that might try to hurt her. You even try to shield her from sort of adult concepts in general. You can avoid swearing around her. You just sort of try to be careful about the things that she's exposed to, the way you would with a child in a normal everyday situation. Now, obviously, they are not in a normal everyday situation. They're in an apocalyptic world filled with monsters, and that sort of changes people's perspectives on what's important. And I think one of the first things to go out the window for a lot of people are your morals, what you deem as right and wrong. It's not as black and white as it could be. It starts to become a very gray area of what is the right thing to do. Is it right if the decision I make hurts someone else, if it allows the people that I care about to survive, to be safe? It gets complicated. But I think in a world where those ideas get completely forgotten is the scariest option. That's where people become murderers and bandits, and in our story, one of the villains you encounter are even cannibals. It's this idea that if the world is filled with monsters, there's not much we could do that is seen as wrong, which I disagree with, and I think the story disagrees with as well. I think it sort of pushes the idea that it's important to know what right and wrong is, even when it starts to become more complicated. And I think Clementine sort of represents that, protecting her from these creatures and from people because she's a little girl and you care about her, but also you're protecting this embodiment, this idea of innocence, of right and wrong, these ideas that kind of go out the window. I think that Clementine is an important character to Lee, not just because Lee is a good person who cares about Clementine, but because Clementine quite literally becomes Lee's reason to exist. She becomes his reason to keep fighting, to keep surviving, where a lot of characters lose a reason to exist, but they continue on because instincts just tell them stay alive. Even if they've lost everything, family, friends, at least they still have their life. It's literally the last thing that they have, for whatever that may be worth. In Lee's situation, when we first meet him and he's on his way to jail, he has been arrested for murder, so he's about to go to jail for a very, very long time. He's definitely lost his job as a professor. He has lost his wife, considering she was cheating on him. We meet Lee at a point in his life where he has lost every sense of normality, and I do believe he is also slightly estranged from his family as well. The specifics of that I don't think you get. But at this point, when we meet Lee, he has lost everything in his life. He really doesn't have something to live for at that point. And when you meet him, he's at a very low place. You can tell his demeanor is one of defeat. Until he meets Clementine. And then suddenly he has this reason to exist, this reason to live. It becomes very, very important to him to stay alive, not just for his sake, but also for her sake. He feels responsible for her. He now has purpose, and she provides that for him. Whereas I think Lee finds that purpose with Clementine, the character that is his mirror, that shows what he could have become without someone like Clementine in his life, is Kenny. Kenny is a character that you meet on the farm very early in the game, and he sticks with you throughout the entirety of the game up to the finale. And through circumstances, when you meet him, he has a wife and he has a son. And through tragic circumstances, he loses both his wife and his son as the story progresses. Now, he doesn't just leave the story when that happens. He becomes fixated on the same plan that he had before he lost his family. It was Kenny's idea to go to the Savannah coast and find a boat because he has a fishing boat. He knows how to run a boat. And when he loses his family, he becomes completely focused on just the idea of we need to go get a boat, we need to keep moving, I need to survive. Even though he's sort of shut down emotionally and lost his family, he makes a lot of decisions that, in my playthrough specifically, Lee and Kenny bump heads over. Because when Kenny has his family, every decision he makes is about keeping his family safe. Not necessarily at the expense of others, but if it came down to it, it would be. He is a much more neutral character than the moral Lee that I played my game as. Kenny is very much survive or don't survive, and there's nothing in between that, regardless of the things you have to do. Now, he still has lines that he won't cross. When you bump into the cannibal family that you have to fight off, he doesn't go, oh, you know what, that is a good idea, we should use people as a resource. No, he still has moral lines that he won't cross, but his rock bottom is much lower than where I played Lee. He was a much more neutral character in my game. So when he loses his family, he doesn't have this reason to keep doing what he's been doing, but he also can't process that he's lost his family, so he just becomes this very instinctual, animal-like character where it's not about, well, let's think about the implications of something, whether it's right or wrong. It just becomes, we need to survive. It's all that matters. Because he has nothing but his life left. That's the only thing he still possesses that's worth anything to him after losing his family. I think he sort of becomes the shell of a character for the remainder of the story because he's lost the one thing that meant the most to him. And I think he is supposed to be a reflection of what Lee could have been if he hadn't found Clementine when he did. I think a big idea of this story is just the idea of, is being alive all that matters? Or is it the connections we have with other people and the relationships we have that make life worth living? I think there's a very instinctual and animalistic side of self-preservation that everybody has, especially in an apocalyptic situation where there's monsters that you have to fight off to survive. I think instincts just take over and you fight to survive. But if you are fighting with a group, if you have people you want to protect or people to protect you, is that existence better than a safer existence by yourself? I do think that this story kind of gives you the idea to mull over of, well, these bad things happened because I had this person in my group, or because I have a child in my group who is not the brightest, and they have put us in a dangerous situation that wouldn't have happened if we were by ourselves. But then right on the other side of that coin is, but if I was by myself, would I have even made it this far? Not just from a literal standpoint of I had someone who could watch my back and keep me safe, but from a keeping you sane standpoint, having a reason to fight, having a reason to exist. And that is told from a few different perspectives. You get Lee, who didn't have a reason to exist until he met Clementine. You have Kenny, whose reason to exist is his family, which he loses, and then continues to have to exist in this world. And I think there's just a lot of interesting ideas around what it really means to be alive and what becomes important when all else falls apart, when society crumbles and all that's left is you and the person next to you. So there's a lot of very specific story beats that we could talk about and kind of mull over, but I think that the experience of playing the game is mostly just enjoying the narrative, and I feel like if you get into the specifics of that too much, you sort of lose the point or the desire to play it. So let's just kind of talk about how I felt about it overall. I guess let's start with the gameplay itself before I talk about the narrative, because I think there's more to say about the narrative. As far as the gameplay goes, it is a point-and-click adventure game. You're controlling one character the whole time. You walk back and forth in these environments and then scan the area for people to talk to and things to interact with, which allow you to either gain knowledge or gain objects that can be used to then solve puzzles to sort of progress the game. There's quick time events and these action sequences where you have to quickly aim and press the correct buttons in these dire situations to succeed. Otherwise, you will get harmed or in some cases die and have to reset and play a chunk of the game again. The other major mechanics are the conversation options, where you start a conversation, it gives you a time limit bar that shrinks, and then you pick out of a few option choices to try to convey the feelings you'd like to convey. And I think those are much more interesting than the actual exploration. I think the exploration itself can get a little bit tedious. I think it serves its purpose in regards that if you weren't actively interacting with the game, then it would just be you watching a movie, which is what sets a game apart. The interactivity, your ability to physically control what happens. Physically control what is happening. So I think the gameplay does give you just enough of a feeling of being in control and feeling like you are the one participating in the story, especially when it comes to the conversation options that you get to pick and how people react to things. But the exploration side of things, sometimes it's just tedious. There are many times where I just wanted to see what was going to happen next in the story, but I had to go into an office to open the right drawer, to find a set of keys, to unlock a door, to then progress the story. Now, don't get me wrong, there are these more exciting action sequences, but that does not happen throughout the entire game. A lot of it really is just walking around, investigating a new area, having small talk with characters, and can be a little bit dull. But I do think it serves its purpose. It's not the most exciting thing in the world, but if you are here for a narrative experience, it does the job. Now, as far as the narrative itself, again, the game caters to the choices that you pick and the conversation options that you pick, so my experience may be a completely different experience than you. But from my experience, I think the narrative is excellent. I definitely learned to care about these characters, and the more background you get about them, the more interested you become in them. You start to make it through these dire situations together, and you as a player really form a bond with characters, even characters you may not like. This mutual aspect of surviving in this world and getting to know them, you form a bond with all of these people, and especially Clementine. Oh my goodness, Clementine is the most wonderful ray of sunshine character that there is. You really want to protect her. Oh my gosh, can't even get words out. But you really do want to protect this little girl as a player and narratively as Lee. You just become very, very invested in these characters to the point where by the end of the game, when you hit the finale, which I won't talk about the specifics, but when you get to the finale, I choked up. I mean, it brought tears to my eyes. I remember it did when I was younger and I played, and it did it again now as an adult. Even though I knew what was going to happen, it still hit me just as strong. So I think narratively, it really hits marks that you would like. There's tension. There's a lot of times where you don't know what's going to happen or how you're going to get out of a situation. And there was not many times where I was bored with the story. The boredom typically came from the gameplay itself, but anytime big story beats were happening, I was pretty much always 100% invested in what was going on. So overall, I do think that it's worth your time. Now, there's a lot more content and a lot more seasons and things to play, and I can't speak for those. I have not partaken in that newer content, but the first season is still just as solid as it ever was, and I would recommend it to anyone who never got the chance to experience that. So yeah, those are kind of my loose thoughts on the game as a whole, and if it made you want to check it out, feel free. Like I said, it's available on PS5 now, as easy as it's ever been to buy it right off the store. So if you're interested in it, give it a shot. Again, my name is Michael. I appreciate you listening to my ranting and raving and lack of really making any sort of point. But yeah, thank you for your time and have a good rest of your day.